William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I welcome you to the College of Complexes, recorded live in downtown Lakewood area, nestled gently against White Rock Lake. Downtown Lakewood is home to the restaurants with family values and family history to match. Visit the Mecca Restaurant at the corner of Skillman Avenue and Live Oak and tell them you want your reservation to the next College of Complex class.
Well, welcome to the College of Complexes. This is our 193rd meeting since we started in 2000, whatever year it was, 2009, excuse me. Can you hear me all right? No, you can't hear me. You can't hear me. Oh, anyway, we put a speaker on every week, different subject. We require our speakers take a position on an issue, express a point of view. They have to be for or against something. We don't care what it is. If anybody interrupts the speaker, we remind the interrupter that we only listen to one fool at a time. That's very important. That's one of our rules. And when the speaker, we give the speaker up to an hour to make a presentation. If they go over an hour, we cut them off. And then we have questions and answers, not speeches. And then we have remarks, rebuttals. Everybody in the audience gets 5 minutes at the podium to respond to what the speaker said, for or against. And then the speaker has a comment and close the meeting. We're usually done by 9. So anyway, that's how it works. But before we put on our speaker, this is the time. Are there any announcements? Anybody have any announcements they want to make? Now's the time to do it. It's your announcement. Come on up here. Here, up here, make the announcement here. Or you want to make an announcement? Go ahead, you got an announcement.
Okay, I have a whole slew of them. This Monday at 8 p.m. at Main Street Gardens, which is on Main Street between Harwood and St. Paul, is a candlelight vigil for comprehensive immigration reform. Wednesday at noon at Thanksgiving Square, there's going to be bell ringing and prayer and speeches commemorating the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, in which King made his I Had a Dream speech. August 31st, which is Saturday of Labor Day weekend, there will be a teach-in, march, and rally, and it will start at the Texas Theater on Jefferson and Oak Cliff at 10 a.m. The march will begin at noon, and it'll be 8 blocks to Oak Cliff Methodist, and it'll conclude with a rally and hot dogs and a party. And I have more, but I won't go further because this gets into September.
Any other announcements? Well, I'll just make a couple here. Next week, for what it's worth, it's on your itinerary there. It shows UFOs and alien abductions, fact versus fiction. The speaker will be Pat O'Connell. She's sitting right here, a little blonde in the corner here, good looking. Anyway, she'll talk about UFOs and alien abductions. She will show examples of some of the most common misidentifications, and she will expose a couple of famous hoaxes. But she'll also debunk the debunkers in a few notable cases, including the 2008 Stephenville lights. Pat is currently trained to be a field investigator for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. Her position is that of an open-minded skeptic who believes that, yes, some truths are being kept from us. Anyway, she'll be here next week, and she's here now, so that's our speaker for next week, just so you know. The other speakers, we have it's on the itinerary that you have. August 31st, Gene Lance will be here talking about Labor Day, past, present, and future. And September 7th, we have 5 famous free thinkers. It's Dr. Stephen Butler. September 21st, Nuts and Flakes, Creation American Breakfast Food Industry with Paul Benson. And on October 5th, Beyond Law and Legislation, a Real-Life Perspective of Unintended Pregnancy, Michelle Valentino. Those are all in front of you. You can look them over. Anyway, having said all that, our speaker tonight is Lloyd Chappell. He's a historian and economist who will question and discuss who will be the puppet master. Who are the puppet masters of the Congress and the White House? Who do 90% of the Congress, 98%, the 99% of the congressmen and the White House fear to criticize? The organization that had to be considered in secret in some of the wealthiest men in the world, the Federal Reserve Bank. They are not part of the federal government, pay no taxes, are not regulated to our congressional, I can't read my own writing here, our congressional committees, and answer to the responsible, except that they can corporate, anyway. Although I'll let him give the rest of it, and it's a long speech. Anyway, Lloyd Chappell, give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. This is the first speech I've ever been commissioned to do. The last time I spoke here in April on the coming inflation. Louder? Okay. This is the first speech I've ever been commissioned to do. When I spoke here in April on the coming inflation, I asked the College of Complexes, would you like to hear about the history of the Federal Reserve, the greatest scam in American history? I received a resounding hell yes. So here I am. This has been a very daunting task for me. I've had to do 60 to 70 hours of research and writing to write this. I've studied the Fed for years. The amazing thing, when you get down deep into the Federal Reserve Bank, I was extremely humbled by my studies. I thought I knew American history and modern economics and finance and business. But when you get down deep into the Fed, you really wonder, do you really know anything? Because we're going to go pretty far down the rabbit hole. And the Fed has some pretty amazing propaganda and marketing, which I will tell you is false. I've avoided doing this speech for a number of years. I've wanted to do this for at least 3.5 years. However, I'm a registered investment advisor. I don't want to be labeled anti-establishment, nor do I want to be called a conspiracy theorist, i.e. a kook. But you were so kind as to tell me you wanted to learn about this, and I am so disgusted and fed up with these people, I don't care anymore. Now I wanted to personally invite our Dallas Fed to come hear this, but I thought, well, now I won't be that cheeky. The power of the Federal Reserve is staggering. In many regards, they are more powerful than Congress or the presidency. They can control what we pay for our car payments, for our house payment, how many people are working, yet they answer to no one. It's absolutely amazing. Now, Tom, would you pass these out to people who want them? The last time I spoke here, my dear father said, oh, gee, son, it's so much information, I can't keep up with it. I have a cheat sheet of my main points, and I have a number of my references. And by all means, don't take my word for any of this. This speech was written 100% from information in the public domain. You can get on the internet and find all of this. To me, the Federal Reserve Bank is an issue that can unite Democrats, Republicans, the far right, the far left, the Tea Party, and the Occupy Wall Street movement. Because folks, we are all getting ripped off, and we are getting ripped off equally. The Federal Reserve likes to portray themselves as our kindly uncle, kind of like Charles Kuralt. Remember Charles Kuralt, who had that cool program Sunday morning, and he'd drive around rural America? Everybody loved him. I thought he was a cool guy. But when he died, we discovered he was a polygamist, and he had 2 families across the country that didn't know about each other. Well, that's very much like the Fed. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank is what's called a central bank. Many times, when you hear the word central bank, you think government. But no, a central bank is just a whole bunch of private bankers who get in charge of a country's monetary system, and they're in charge of banking processes. Our current Federal Reserve is the 3rd central bank in American history. Our first one was 1791 to 1811, and the next one was 1816 to, oops, typo, it should be 1836. Now, Andrew Jackson, for all of his faults, bought the 2nd Bank of the United States. And whatever it cost, he got rid of it. But it's so ironic. Whose face is on the $10 bill for the 3rd Central Bank of America? Andrew Jackson. Now, this is a quote by Thomas Jefferson, who was adamantly opposed to the 1st Central Bank, the 1st Bank of America. And he says, if we let private bankers create money out of nothing, and cause inflation and deflation, we're in a world of hurt. Well, what's the difference between a central banker and a catfish? One is cold and slimy. One is a fish. Okay, the Federal Reserve Bank is a cartel. Ron Paul is right. Now, personally, everything Ron Paul talks about, minus the Federal Reserve Bank, I can do without. But when he talks about the Federal Reserve Bank, I have never known him to be wrong about anything. Well, a cartel is just a monopoly of a bunch of usually very large businesses. Traditionally, you think of a monopoly as just one business that corners a market. But when you get a bunch of really big businesses that work, that cooperate, then they can dominate a market. Well, I'm throwing out a lot of assertions here, and I'm saying the Federal Reserve Bank is a private bank. And most people, I've even had presidents of large corporations say in so many words, Lloyd, you need help. There's something wrong with you. Everybody knows the Federal Reserve Bank is government. Well, I got this here, Yellow Pages. It showed up at my door. And, I don't know if you can see this here. We come up here. You can see Federal Labor Relations, Federal Trade. Oh my gosh, where is the Federal Reserve Bank? Well, we come to the next page, here it is, the Federal Reserve Bank, and then there's FedEx up there. The Federal Reserve is as federal as FedEx. If you go through the website of the Federal Reserve Bank, which is some of the best smoke and mirrors nonsense marketing I've ever seen, they tell you that the Fed is owned by private banks. Well, the Fed got its real impetus from what was known as the Panic of 1907, which was a big deal for our country. The stock market lost 50%. We had a very serious recession. Banks were falling right and left. And we had no one central authority. Banks had no place to go if they got in trouble. There was what is called no bank of last resort. Enter J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest American bankers. He and a bunch of his buddies got together, they scraped up some money, they helped capitalize the banks that they thought they could, he was considered the man of the hour. But history being what it is, we know things will repeat. So there's going to be another banking crisis. What can we do? Well, it's funny that J.P. Morgan, when you play the game Monopoly, the banker is actually J.P. Morgan. That's who was patterned after. Later, Morgan was accused, quite rightly, of having started the bank panic of 1907. He just let out that certain banks were not really well capitalized, didn't have much money. Then there was a run on those banks. And most banks have very, very little money compared to what they lend out. If there's a run on the bank, most banks are dead. The only way you can stop a run on a bank is usually shut down, have like a banker holiday like President Roosevelt did in the 1930s. At this time in American history, if we look at the early 1900s, people were very concerned about something called the money trust. There was a very small group of super, super wealthy guys that it looked like they were essentially running this country. Even though we're a democracy, they're calling the shots. Now what they did is that a large of the large New York banks, they would own stock of many large companies. Many J.P. Morgan and Rockefeller executives were on the boards of what would be the Fortune 500 companies. They controlled banks, trust companies, railroads, factories, all sorts of stuff. At this time, there was another name for the money trust, and that was the New World Order. I always thought the New World Order was conspiracy theory stuff for our time. Oh no. The New World Order goes back to the turn of the century. Well, we come to the fateful meeting that led to the origin of the Federal Reserve Bank. And if you look on your notes, I got this from a Saturday Evening Post article of February 9th, 1935. Because the guys who put together the Fed, they gave interviews, one of them wrote an autobiography. All of this information is in the public domain. Well, what happened is that there was a meeting of 7 incredibly wealthy guys on the resort island, Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. Now, Jekyll Island was where the Morgans and the Rockefellers would go in the wintertime because the weather was nice and it's cold in New York, so they'd go hang out there now. The state of Georgia, and this is their clubhouse, the state of Georgia now owns this, and you can go there. It's a really nice place. There's one room that has a plaque on it, a boardroom, and it says, this was where the Federal Reserve Bank was created. Well, the way that it started is that Senator Nelson Aldrich, a very wealthy fellow, and the whip of the Republican Party, sent his private rail car to a New Jersey rail station. 6 other men that we're about to see showed up under conditions of serious secrecy. They didn't all show up at the same time. They didn't eat together. They didn't even act like they knew each other. One of them showed up with a shotgun, who later said that he'd never fired a gun in his life. But his cover story was that he was going duck hunting. The problem was, newspaper reporters are everywhere, and they did not want it to get out that these guys were getting together. The guy who got all this going, the fellow with the private rail car, was Nelson W. Aldrich. I have a misspelling, Aldrich. He was a business associate of J.P. Morgan. He was also the chairman of the National Monetary Commission because after the banking panic of 1907, Congress put together the National Monetary Commission to come up with recommendations on how the hell do we not have this happen to our country again. Then we had Andrew Piatt Andrews, who was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, a former economics professor at Harvard, later became a congressman, and was very prominent in banking circles. Then we have Frank Vanderlip, who wrote this article that you can read on the internet. If you can't find it, give me your card, I'll email it to you. I have a copy. He was the president of National City Bank of New York, which was at that time the largest and most powerful bank in America. Then we had Charles Norton, president of Citibank of New York, Henry Davidson, senior executive of J.P. Morgan, Benjamin Strong, the head of the J.P. Morgan investment banking, and the fellow who was really the star of this show, Paul Warburg. Can you not hear me over there? Oh, I hate to talk any louder. Paul Warburg was a naturalized German citizen. He became an American citizen, and he represented the German banking firm that had offices in the United States of Kuhn and Loeb. He was also an associate of the Rothschilds. Being a European, he had experience with the Central Bank of Germany and with the Bank of England. And it was his brains and his direction that really got us to where we are now. A funny thing is that Paul Warburg was the prototype of Daddy Warbucks in Little Orphan Annie. Well, you may say, why did these guys meet in secrecy? I mean, they go on this long train ride. Even at Jekyll Island, they did not call each other by their full names because they didn't want the staff who worked there to talk to the press. What's wrong with a bunch of bankers getting together talking about banking? Well, if it was to be, and here I'm quoting Paul Vanderlip in his article, if it was to be exposed that these guys got together, the bill would be killed. Why? Because the purpose of supposedly the National Monetary Commission was to break the grip of the money trust. And here we have all the executives of the money trusts getting together to write a bill. It's not a whole lot different from asking the fox to design the security system for the hen house and then have him install it. Because if the public ever knew that these guys got together and cranked out a bill, that bill would be as good as dead. Now, there's something really odd about these group of guys. Here we got the Morgans, the Rothschild, Kuhn and Loeb, Rockefellers, other European banks, because some of the owners of the Federal Reserve Bank are European banks, which we'll see. Before these guys got together, their companies had fought viciously, aggressively in Europe and in the United States for market dominance. But now they're coming together. And this is something that is usually not mentioned in economics textbooks. I'm amazed. You find any college economic textbook, they don't tell you the Fed is a cartel. They don't tell you the Fed is a bunch of private bankers. This is at a time in American history known as the dawning of the cartels. And the real irony of this is that these companies that became huge and wealthy through the free enterprise system are now getting together to hinder that very system. John D. Rockefeller said competition is a sin, because what they tried to do, they couldn't destroy their competition, as John D. Rockefeller killed many oil companies through low prices. If that didn't work, then they just tried to buy them out. If that didn't work, then they got them to join the cartel. What the Federal Reserve Act did is it made this cartel of private bankers legal by law. Now, this cartel, the Fed, went into partnership with the federal government. And in any partnership, there has to be benefits for both parties. Well, what is the benefits for the government, and what is the benefits for the Fed? To do that, we have to ask the question, how does money come into being in our country? Congress needs money. Congress needs a lot of money. Now let's just say a little piddly project of $10 billion. That's what Congress needs. So they go to the Treasury Department and they say, can you give us a check? We have, a bill passed. We need $10 billion. And the Treasury Department says, oh, you spent all your money by April. We don't have any money for you. So then they go to the Federal Reserve Bank. Say, we need $10 billion. The Fed officer says, no problem. Opens a drawer, pulls out a checkbook, writes them a check for $10 billion. Now remember, the Federal Reserve Bank is not a regular bank. They don't have depositors. Where did they get the $10 billion? This is a hard thing to realize. The Fed does not have an account. The Fed just has a checkbook. The oops, I see a typo here. The $10 billion that they gave to the federal government comes into being when they wrote the check, because they have no money. Now, why does Congress allow this? Congress is in partnership with them because if they have to raise taxes, we're going to vote them out. We're going to be pissed off. But with the Federal Reserve Bank, they have easy access to money. And they overlook that this money is created out of nothing. That is one of the hardest things to realize. They lend us money created out of nothing. This is why the federal government is in this partnership. Now, here, this comes from a Fed publication, putting it simply. And they tell us, they tell us what they did. They say that when all of us write a check, there has to be money in our account. But when the Fed writes a check, they have no money, and they are creating money. Well, now the question is, why is the Fed in this partnership? Well, let's just track a $10,000 deposit by a Homeland Security executive. Homeland Security executive goes to the bank, puts in his paycheck, $10,000. So now we have $10,000 in the banking system. The banker then goes to the loan window and says, hey folks, we have money to loan. And somebody would say, wait a minute, he only had $10,000. I need more money than that. The banker says, not to worry. We can loan now up to $90,000. So you think, where did the $90,000 come from? Only $10,000 additional was put in this bank. Well, the Fed has our monetary and banking system sewed up. The Fed says that you only need 10% money on hand to loan out 90% more. I have to go over this several times. This is tricky. $10,000 represents 10% of $100,000. And the Fed says you only need 10% reserves to lend out more money. So if you have if $10,000 represents 10% of $100,000, that means you can lend out another $90,000. Or to put it a much simpler way, the way that the Fed has this lined up, they can lend out 9 times as much money as they ever have on hand. Any bank. How do I know this? Well, I downloaded this comic book from the internet, and the Fed wrote this comic. It's called The Story of the Federal Reserve System. Now, if we look down here at the bottom, they say this in so many words. Okay, somebody puts in $100, so they lend out $90, and that money comes back, and then they lend out 90% of that and 90% of that. So eventually, they do that 9 times. That's about $1,000. Any bank, including the Federal Reserve Bank in America, in Europe, in Japan, can lend out 9 times as much money as they ever have on hand. Banks and the Federal Reserve create money out of nothing. This is a really interesting point. Okay, the Fed creates money out of nothing and lends it to the federal government for its projects. They collect interest on this money, but they don't spend it. They then lend it to us back for our projects. What the Federal Reserve Bank is in this for is to collect interest on money created out of nothing. This is why they're in it. And if you look at the trillions of dollars we owe them, if you look at the trillions of dollars of Treasury bonds, of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac bonds that they owe, this is not too shabby. That's a great cartoon. I don't know if you can read it back there, but there's a sign right here. This guy's by the Federal Reserve, and it says, please wait, your dollars are being printed. Well, They had to come up with a name at Jekyll Island. What are they going to call this thing? Because the American people were on record saying they didn't want another central bank. They didn't want private bankers. And here we see the brilliance. These guys are geniuses. They said, okay, let's call it federal to make it sound like it's government. Then they said, let's say that we have reserves. So it sounds like we have reserves. In the past 25 years, there's been 2 attempts to audit the Fed. One by Barney Frank and Henry Gonzalez, another by Ron Paul. In each case, it is put down. And it is put down because they don't have reserves. So that people realize they don't have reserves, they can't lend money anymore. Then they said, let's call it a bank. Oh, they're controlling banking, let's call it a bank. And then they said, let's call it a system. Because that way it'll sound like that instead of these powerful New York banks that own the Fed, that instead of them, dominating us, power will be diffused. Well, this is false on all accounts. They are not government. They don't have reserves. They don't do banking, and power is not diffused. We will look at in a minute who owns the bank, and you will see power is not diffused. Now, this nonsense marketing is not really nonsense because it has fooled 95% of Americans for almost 100 years. This is the seal, I just pulled it off the internet, of the Federal Reserve Bank. Does this look like private industry to you? Oh, these folks are slick. Well, the next thing they had to do, they had to get their bill passed. And Senator Aldrich really screwed up. He put his name on it. And he was associated with Fat Cat, New York bankers. It was defeated. Now, I don't know if you can see this cartoon. This came out in 1912. This is absolute genius because here, somebody realized that how rotten the Fed system is. Here's a giant octopus with its tentacles around the Treasury, Congress, the White House, industry, banks. It's exactly what happened. And the first bill failed. But these guys are not stupid. Plus, these guys have deep pockets. What they did, and they have very deep pockets, they actually funded different departments of economics across the country who, of course, touted the Fed system. They hired journalists. They printed pamphlets. They were in newspapers. They started study groups. They spent money. Then they took the failed bill and they just moved paragraphs around. And instead of having fat cat Republicans, they got a couple of multi-millionaire Democrats, Carter Glass and Robert Owen, to sponsor the bill. Now, you'll notice my note at the end that I really believe the concerns of the working man are truly represented by multi-millionaire Democrats as well as multi-millionaire Republicans. Well, then they really got smart. Senator Aldrich and Paul Warburg went all over the country saying, oh my God, you cannot pass this Glass-Owen bill. It will wreck the banks. It'll ruin banks. And most people said, well, these guys don't like it. It must be pretty good. The last holdout against the Fed system was William Jennings Bryan, the populist. And Paul Warburg convinced the other 6 who supported the bill that what they needed to do was take out the provision where the Federal Reserve Bank could create money out of nothing. And he received a lot of resentment from his fellow soon-to-be central bankers. They said, well, that's why we're doing this. He says, no, you don't understand. Once we get the bill passed, we can doctor it any way we want. So they took that out. William Jennings Bryan agreed to it. However, since the Federal Reserve Bill was passed in 1930, they have added over 100 provisions. And the ability to create money out of nothing was put back in. The Fed was legalized December 22nd, 1913. The amazing thing, just about all of Congress had gone home, and Congress was promised that there wouldn't be a bill, there wouldn't be a vote on the Fed until they came back. Plus the fact the vote for the Fed was taken after 4 a.m. in the morning. When have you heard a bill in Congress voted on at 4 a.m. in the morning? Really? Oh, we're talking about national Congress. Well, the Fed has, you get on the Federal Reserve website, which I just roll on the floor laughing at their nonsense. They have three objectives. They're to provide banking operations, banking services, to regulate them, and to conduct the nation's monetary policies so we will have a stable economy. That is their cover story. Here's a little graphic I pulled off the Fed website. What a bunch of nonsense. Well, let's give them a report card. They say that that's what they wanted to do. How well did they do? Okay, we had the Depression of 1921, the Great Depression, 1929 to 47, recessions in 1923, 1926, 1953, 57, 69, 73 through 75, 81, 1991, and the last recession of 2007 to 2009. Corporate debt is growing. The interest on the national debt this year is $248 billion and will be $458 billion in 2016, according to the Office of Management and Budget. We have moved a ton of heavy industry across the seas, and the trade deficit is $500 billion. And you can see this goes on and on and on. Plus the fact Milton Friedman and Anna Swartz wrote a book arguing that the Federal Reserve Bank made the crisis of 29 into a depression. And they have a very, very good argument. What the Federal Reserve Bank did from 1929 to 1932, they contracted the amount of cash in the money in the country by 1/3. So if you think it takes this much money to run our economy and now we have this much, there's going to be bankruptcies, foreclosures, all kind of businesses going out of business, and guess who picked them up for pennies on the dollar? The Fed banks. Now this is hard to see, but this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. One of the Fed's job is to manage inflation. Since 1913, what cost $1 now costs $23. What kind of a report card would you give the Fed for managing inflation? Well, it looks like a massive failure to me. They failed at anything. And can anybody here tell me what one correct policy the Fed has gotten right in 20 years? I speak to bankers. I can't get them to raise their hand on anything. But those were never its true objectives. What we have to ask is, what are the objectives of any cartel? What is OPEC's objective? And it's two things: to enhance the profits of the cartel, to make as much as they can, and to dominate the market. It's interesting that the word dominate comes from the Roman word dominus, which is the name that a slave calls his master. It's interesting, and you read what the Jekyll Island boys wrote. They told us what their objectives were. The first thing they said is they wanted to stop the erosion of power away from the big New York banks. They didn't want the banks in the Midwest and the South and the West competing with them on any kind of big way. The next, and this is banker language, they wanted to prevent private capital formation. Many large corporations were self-funding. If they wanted to build a new factory, or they wanted to do research and development, or something else, they would just save up their money and do it. And the New York bankers thought, no, they need to be borrowing money from us. Last, they wanted to pass on their losses to the American people. Well, how did they succeed at this? At all 3 points, they succeeded incredibly. This is kind of hard to see, but here I have some of the Fed banks: J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citibank, Wells Fargo. All other banks pale in consideration. These banks have offices in Beijing, London, Paris, Madrid. We have some very well-capitalized banks here in Texas, like BB&T. They can never compare to the Fed banks. what the Fed originators wanted to do is they said that they wanted to create something called flexible currency. And the problem is that at that time, nobody could just pull a lever and change interest rates. Interest rates at that time were dependent on gold and treasury bonds. But they wanted to entice the businessmen back into the banks. So what they essentially did is create money out of nothing and then get interest rates so low that businessmen thought they'd have to be crazy not to come in and borrow money. Why should they save their own money? And then bailouts in this country are really unstoppable. I have a fascinating document here. This is a study of the Federal Reserve by the General Accounting Office. You can't see it. I was hoping you could see it here. But let me read you some of this. Okay. Who do you think got the biggest bailout from the subprime crisis? The folks that did the worst stuff. Citibank got $2.5 trillion. Morgan Stanley, $2 trillion. Now, good old Merrill Lynch. I love to talk to Merrill Lynch reps. Merrill Lynch needed $1.9 trillion or they were going to have to shut their doors. They got $1.9 trillion. Then Bank of America got $1.3 trillion, who then acquired Merrill Lynch. So Bank of America got $3 trillion. And it goes on. We have Goldman Sachs. We have J.P. Morgan Chase. Part of the whole Federal Reserve System is to protect their own. Now, do you think that little small savings and loans in West Texas, if they get into, they need money, do you think the Fed gives them anything? No. Because the system was not created for them, it was created for Fed Bank affiliates. That's a great quote from Seth Meyers. Now, this came right after AIG got a bailout. He said that we needed a $30 billion bailout, and what we should do is build $15 billion to build the largest toilet in the world so we can flush down the other $15 billion. Oh, now here's Bernanke. Talk about asleep at the wheel. 2007, he says it would not be responsible or appropriate to protect lenders. But they cranked out over $8 trillion for Fed banks the next year. Well, who owns the Fed? Let's look at good old factcheck.org. I love it. Here's the owners of the Fed Bank. Rothschild of London, Warburg of Hamburg, Rothschild of Berlin, Lehman Brothers, Lazard, Israel Moses CF Banks, Goldman, and on. It's an interesting quote from Henry Ford at the turn of the century. He's not too far off. Give a man a gun, he can rob a bank. Give a man a central bank, he can rob the world. What amazes me, the Fed is more secretive than the NSA or the FBI. And the NSA has been under a lot of criticism for what they've done. To recap this speech, the Fed is accountable to no one. It has no budget. It is subject to no audit, and it will not permit an audit. Its stranglehold over the media is unbelievable. In 1920, in a congressional inquiry, it was discovered that J.P. Morgan had 20 news services under its employ. No bad news about J.P. Morgan comes out. There's no oversight. There is congressional oversight for the NSA and CIA. There is none for the Fed. The Fed controls our monetary system, and they pay no taxes. If anybody can produce an income tax return by this private corporation, I'll take you to Del Frisco's for whatever you want. And the amazing thing is that the Fed passes off all of its expenses to the federal government. Organized greed always defeats disorganized democracy. And I have a quote down here from a book written in 1922 called The Federal Reserve Monster. When a thing needs reforming, it needs the axe. Well, Congress voted these clowns in, it can vote them out. And one argument that I have that no one has ever been able to beat. Everything the Federal Reserve Bank does, it is private enterprise. everything they do, they're looking at their profit. Now, they don't want to admit that in public, but they're looking to make profit. If we nationalize the Fed, they could be just as incompetent and just as stupid, but they would not be trying to make a profit off of us. Well, there's another speech. I spent a lot of work on this one. It'll be 6 months before I come back here. But the Fed represents a system. They're not alone. It's Bank of Japan, Bank of Germany, Bank of Spain, Bank of England. All of this entire system, our money is created from debt. It wasn't that way in American history in the Revolutionary War, and it was not that way during the Civil War. The government made the money. When government makes our money, there is no debt. So, 6 months from now, would you like to learn what's behind this system of money as debt? Yes? Yes, okay. Oh, now I would like to say that the definitive book is The Creature from Jekyll Island by E.B. Griffin. You want to delve into this stuff? Delve into it. So, I will open the floor for questions.
Who wants to be first? There you are.
Lloyd? Good. You point out that the contraction of the money supply caused the Great Depression.
It made it much worse.
I don't have any trouble believing that. On the other hand, we know that the Fed creates money out of nothing. So now we have contraction of the money supply and creation of the money supply, both get us into trouble. So you might comment on that.
At that time, they were not creating money. They believed that, and if you look at statements from the Treasury Department, who then later became Fed governors, that they truly believed that if they contracted the money supply, that there was a lot of inefficient businesses out there that needed to die, and they were going to die, and out of the ashes would rise a new economy. So during this strategic 3-year period, they did not create money out of nothing. And then they then had the ability to buy thousands of businesses and banks for pennies on the dollar. Okay.
Got a question? Oh, wow. That surprised me. The Chinese have been buying a lot of gold. Mm-hmm. And they recently arranged with the Soviets to do all their currency exchange in yuan. Now, Nixon in 1971 took us off the gold standard and we went to petrodollars. And the world was getting further and further away from petrodollars. And there's, in the back of my mind, it's suggesting with the way the Chinese are buying on the exchanges gold today, are the Chinese heading towards establishing the world's primary currency, reserve currency, be the yuan, or are they going to get back on the gold standard?
I think that the Chinese are trying to they want to be the world reserve currency. Reserve currency is when all the world does business in your money. And let's face it, the dollar is getting pretty ugly. If I ran a Fortune 500 company, I would want my money in Chinese yuan. I wouldn't want it in the dollar because we are facing a dollar devaluation. It's coming. We are doing everything wrong, and we're doing it in the royal fashion.
I heard that in 2003 that one of the motives for going to war in Iraq was because the euro was becoming the world currency and one of the reasons for going into this war was to reestablish the dollar as a world currency, because at that time the euro was very strong. Do you agree with that assessment?
I have no comment either way. I would question that and have to research that before I made that assertion. And we did have at that time one of the greatest incompetents in American history, George W. Bush.
Yes, sir. What would be the impact of nationalizing the Federal Reserve? What's the best way to reform this to sort of dilute some of its power that it has? Or what would be the impact of nationalizing, say, the Reserve Bank, and to sort of dilute some of its power and influence?
Well, the only way to dilute their power is economically cut their throat by nationalizing them. And what it would mean that from here on out, when money is created in America, it's not created as debt to the American people. Going forward, it would be fabulous. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, what I'd like to know is what is the name of the book you held up and the author?
It is The Creature from Jekyll Island by E.B. Griffin.
By who?
E.B. Griffin. It's holding up a copy.
Hi, you've mentioned that your proposed plan would be to nationalize the Fed.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you walk us through that briefly, please? What would the ramifications be? How would it be conducted?
Congress voted in the Fed. Congress can vote out the Fed. The banks that own the Fed, as you saw, are gigantic banks. They would not go down without kicking and screaming. It would be, I don't see that we can do this for a generation or two. And it is a world system. It would need to happen worldwide, but maybe it could start here first. But you think about interest on trillions of dollars. Who the world's going to let that, who wants to have that taken away from them? No, they'll fight, and they'll fight hard, and they'll fight dirty.
So as a follow-up question, when you talk about nationalizing something, what does that mean specifically?
That means that you pick up the newspaper tomorrow and it says Federal Reserve Bank, 100% owned by the federal government. And we have to call up the executives of J.P. Morgan and Chase and say, oh, by the way, we're going to pay you back one of these days. We just don't know when, but you don't own the Fed anymore. Have a nice day.
So would there be an additional organization set up for oversight then at the federal level to oversee the nationalization of this?
Well, it would be that everything that the Fed does, I mean, the Fed does a lot in banking and checking accounts, and all checks clear through the Fed, of which they probably make, a thousandth of a penny, but with as many checks that go through this country, that's a lot of money. All of that would stay the same, and then the new government Federal Reserve Bank could do monetary policy, and I couldn't imagine they'd do any worse than the morons we got now. They couldn't. And if they're just as bad, well, at least they're not trying to make a profit off the American people. At least. It's worth a try, folks. They couldn't be any worse.
Yeah, Lloyd, I'd like to know what your feeling was if we didn't have the talk and the bailout of these different things. How would the world economy be today if we didn't have any monetary or any central banks in any country in the world? Where would we be today?
We would be a whole lot better off.
Well, tell me how. A whole lot better off sounds like I'll give you some ice cream later. tell me how we'd be better off when the whole world economy was falling on its face. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me to say we'll be a whole lot better off. Be a little more specific.
Okay, the reason in 2007 and 8 that we were collapsing was from activities from the investment banks, of the Fed banks, of the mortgage derivatives gone bad by JP Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America. They caused this problem. One of the things we will get rid of when we get rid of the Fed and the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan is something called the boom-bust cycle. If you look at our history, in the 1920s, in the 1990s, in the past decade, particularly the past decade, the Fed created an unbelievable amount of money out of nothing. That money went to the hottest place in the market, which was the mortgage market and mortgage-backed derivatives. So what essentially the Fed does is, instead of a market cycle that just kind of goes like this, it goes way up and crashes.
That's not my question. My question was a very simple question.
Okay, what the
and my question was, where would we be today with no TARP or nothing like that? Now, we still have the Federal Reserve, we still had the greatest recession since the Great Depression. Where would we be today if we said we're not going to bail these people out? What would happen to the
in that
world
situation
economy?
in 2008, our entire monetary system would have collapsed. So we can say one thing that the Fed did right, but remember, who brought it to the point of collapse? Fed banks. One way to think about it, okay, in the world there is about $70 trillion of debt owned by governments. If governments created their own money, there would not be any debt on that. We would have hundreds of billions of dollars. We have to pay $248 billion in interest on the national debt this year. If we made our own money, we wouldn't have to do that. And that money is going to Citibank, Chase, JP Morgan, the folks that don't need it. Yes, sir.
This might be appropriate to an introductory overview of what's going on. I'd just like to address what's on the notes themselves, the words of obligation, as they're called. From 1934 to 1963, the Federal Reserve notes indicated that this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank or United States Treasury office. That was taken off in '63. I'm not sure exactly when, but the notes that we received with the green stamps are not backed by anything. There's nothing behind them. However, we did have U.S. notes, the red seals, that were drawn on the United States Treasury. We had Treasury certificates with the little blue seal. And what I'm addressing here in terms of a question is, why would it be necessary to overhaul the entire system? All we really need to do is get rid of this system of minting money, as you very beautifully pointed out. I mean, it comes from nowhere. And there's nothing behind it but credit for people's willingness to pay. But if we would get back to a system that I'm sure even Jefferson himself would have approved of, under the circumstances. He didn't want any U.S. bank. That was a big battle with Hamilton, as we all know. But the problems are really very different now, aren't they? I mean, that big battle was basically over paying off the scrip for the people in the Continental Army and that sort of thing. But what I'm wondering about is, would it really be necessary, I don't know where you get the votes, to nationalize something like the Federal Reserve?
It would only be after an unbelievable, terrible crisis, as in a horrible depression.
Maybe we should have let it all crash.
It's tempting, but I didn't have enough gold stashed back at that time. Next question.
Yes. I have the mic. Would you agree that the the power of any country comes from the productive output of its people. Has nothing to do with the productive gambling of the banks. And so what we've done is actually destroy the productive power of the people by shifting productivity overseas. So what we need to do in this country is to actually start to implement policies that get America back to work and be productive, because that is the strength of the country. So you have to have a banking system that reflects that. Do you agree?
Yes and no. We need to completely change our monetary system from the ground up, completely. Then we can talk about jobs.
Well,
it won't make any sense until we do it.
Well, look, to grow out of this recession we're in, you have to grow jobs. Okay? Now, instead of bailing out the foreign banks, we should have funded job growth. And I would have looked the banks forward. And then we nationalised several banks. The Bank of Scotland, and then that's what should have happened here. And then they could have forced change. You could have said, Bank A, B, and C, you're broke, you're down. Fire the top management, they may vote, confiscate their damn money. Right?
You know why they don't do that?
Look, because this is a capitalist world, right? And damn the people.
No, because if Bank of America went down and $2 trillion of depositors' money went to nothing, they would go running and screaming to their congressmen, and the congressmen would say, oh no, we have to bail them out. We can't lose all this money. That's what they do.
That's what should have happened to the banks.
Okay, so
the Republic would have been saved, right?
No.
Yeah, they would have been saved.
No. Do you know the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation has $1 billion to insure over $12 trillion of deposits? We have a smoke and mirror system. We just have something that makes us feel good. The system needs to change from the ground up. Also, if we do these policies to create jobs, which is noble, we're looking at 2016 at $20 trillion of a national debt, cranking out $458 billion of interest. In 2.5 years, we're going to have to trim over $250 billion out of the federal budget to pay for this. How are we going to create jobs with that? We have to fix this first. Then we'll have jobs. Yes, sir.
Okay, there was one question Curtis over here had about China buying all the debt, number one. Number two, Iceland has been successful in arresting the bankers. And number three, third question, what would be different? We wouldn't be at war in 6 countries right now with 162 military bases spread all over the world. So,
which question do you want me to address first?
Okay, China and Iceland.
I think that there's a pretty reasonable case that what the Chinese want to do, I mean, they're amassing unbelievable amounts of gold. And what would be very easy for them in the next 2 to 5 years is to approach the world and say, well, you know, everybody does business in dollars, but look at our money. We don't have all this debt, and look at how much gold. Why don't you do business in our money? And once the world says, we're not doing business in American dollars, we are screwed, folks. We're going to have massive inflation. One of the reasons that the subprime crisis did not wreck us is the world does business in our money, and every bank, central bank in the world has billions, hundreds of millions of dollars. But if those dollars look attractive and they dump them, it's going to hurt. And the second question?
Well, actually, shift directions. The Internal Revenue Service, according to the Grace Commission under Reagan, not one single dime goes to anything, hospital, school, roads are being built, all of it, every single dime collected by the Internal Revenue Service goes to pay the interest on the debt we borrow from the Federal Reserve. Could you address that, please?
You know, if we make our own money, that goes away. That all goes away. I was very cheeky. I was at a large business meeting, and the head economist of the Dallas Fed got up and spoke, a PhD from Turkey, a brilliant lady. And I stood up and I said, "Dear Madam Economist, don't you think that since the Federal Reserve at that point was sitting on $2 trillion of treasuries and Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac bonds, don't you think that since that was bought with money created out of nothing, that you should have a bond shredding party and just shred them for the benefit of the American people?" She wouldn't answer the question. Ed.
Thank you. It always helps in these kinds of things to look at a precedent. In this case, what kind of system we could have without the Federal Reserve System. And the thing that comes to my mind is the story of the greenback dollar, which was created by government fiat under the administration of Abraham Lincoln to pay for the Civil War. And just as certain things are restricted in Federal Reserve currency, that greenback dollar had the following special benefit: it only was acceptable in payment of taxes. Really? Therefore, there was always a need for greenback dollars, so it came into circulation and established itself quite well. It was, of course, created out of nothing, the government fiat, but it had the benefit of not creating debt that the government owed to other people to finance its operations.
We ought to at least give it a try once. Why not try?
We made a comment about securities held by other nations. Right now, they're being cashed in at an unprecedented rate. I believe the last figure I saw in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago was $80 billion last week.
I saw that.
All right? So, it's accelerating. All right? The Chinese are sitting on $1.1 trillion worth of petrodollars. They don't know what to do. Another $2 trillion in securities and bonds, and buying gold like there's no tomorrow. It's saturating the exchanges. So what do you see as the future? How much longer is it going to take for the bust to take place? Because it will.
If I knew that, I wouldn't be here. I'd be the next billionaire hedge fund manager. I don't know. The longer the better for all of us, so we can prepare for it. Folks, if you're not buying gold and silver, you ought to think about putting some money there. And the more money you can put into real tangible things, into timberland, farmland, ag land, oil and gas, those are fabulous places to put money, because I believe we are coming to a huge paradigm shift, and we're going to have some really bad inflation within a few years. I can't tell you when exactly, but did you know that in the next year to year and a half, we have $5 billion of short-term Treasury debt due? I've looked at the federal budget. We don't have $5 trillion in cash sitting around. What's our option? The Federal Reserve Bank's going to start printing like crazy. They're going to make tons of money out of nothing to redeem this stuff. And we're already swimming with a money supply that is horribly bloated. So inflation is coming, and we can't stop it. Well, let's let the pretty gal ask a question.
When you were responding to Susie's question about what really would happen if we nationalized the Fed, you said that we would just, Congress would say, it's a done deal, guys, we'll pay you back eventually, but it's ours now. What would we have to pay them back I mean, do we have to pay them all these bazillions of dollars of interest that they're earning on nothing, on the imaginary money?
Well, we should say, okay, we're going to pay you over 20 years, and after about year 2 say, well, we're not going to pay you more, bye. Because, I mean, you think about it. All of us as citizens, we're paying on all this federal debt of money created out of nothing. One way to think about it is the term usury. In the Middle Ages, it was illegal to charge interest on money. But in modern economics, we talk about the opportunity and the enjoyment used. When you lend money, you could be enjoying that money, so you should receive something for it. But perhaps a different definition of usury is paying interest on money created out of nothing. The Fed doesn't like that. Did that answer your question? Oh, okay.
Sure it did. It answered it real well. I want to ask you something that you may know something about, which would be quantitative easing, and what's your feeling on that? Where would we be today when we're getting out of the recession, not as fast as we'd like to, but we're getting out? And when the Fed actually, to stop inflation, it lowers interest rates, once it lowers it to zero, there's no place else to go but quantitative easing. What's your feeling on that?
There are short-term benefits from quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is where the Federal Reserve Bank, by the end of this year, will have created $4 trillion out of thin air, bought treasury bonds, mortgage bonds, Fannie Mae's, Freddie Mac's, and then that money gets into the economy. That has essentially kept us out of recession. But the problem is, there is nothing without costs. When they make money out of nothing, it costs us. It cost us in inflation. It cost us in a bloated money supply. So I believe that all of this quantitative easing, though it has done short-term benefit, will turn into long-term inflation poison. And yeah, we've had it pretty good for 4 years, but at a cost. And it's coming to bite us in the tail. Short-term good, long-term bad, real bad. And once they stop it, watch Wall Street crash. Wall Street has become addicted to this funny money. In it was May 2010, the Federal Reserve Bank stopped creating funny money. Wall Street crashed. It was the flash crash. Then we had QE2. Now we have QE3 indefinite. And once they stop it, watch Wall Street crash. Tom?
Yeah, well, just a question on, I think the IMF is talking about the STDs. I read about this. The Chinese want to get away from the dollar. Other countries want to get away from the dollar. The bank. And the STD is supposed to be a new instrument produced by the IMF for if they want to put the world system on there. It's going to kill us, I'm afraid.
It will kill us.
Now the question is, do you think it's going to happen? How soon?
If I knew that, I'd be the next billionaire hedge fund manager. I don't know. It, in one sense, is more democratic to take like a basket of the world's 10 largest currencies and make your money off of that. I mean, as a citizen of the world, that's quite attractive. As an American citizen, that is extremely unattractive, because it will mean for us inflation, big-time inflation. I would say within the next 5 years, we will probably lose the dollar as the world currency for business. We're seeing many places in the world right now, like the Chinese and the Russians, the Iranians and the Chinese. They exchange each other's goods outside of the dollar. And many of the emerging market countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Korea, they don't want to do business in the dollar because they see it as destabilizing and inflationary. And they're telling the truth. It's not pleasant, it's not happy, but they're telling the truth. And we should not be angry at that. In fact, Bernanke told them 2 years ago, You don't like our money? Don't use it. He said that. And they took his advice, and they quit using it. And it's hurting us, folks.
We've got a couple of questions, please. Since the Industrial Revolution, machines replace people, machines don't pay taxes. There are 25 million people out of work right now in this country. And we have a situation where corporations are going overseas where labor costs are cheaper. So we've lost a lot of jobs. So you say that we have to go straighten out the monetary system before we straighten anything else out?
We have many things to straighten out, but that would be, I think we would get more benefit doing that way. I would have to be dictator before that would happen, and I don't know if everybody here can vote me dictator, but I don't see that we're going to get rid of this Federal Reserve Bank for at least a generation or two, if we're lucky. They are so powerful, and their control over the media is stunning. To give you an example, I saw on YouTube Glenn Beck, who I consider a real loose Republican cannon. He's a real loose cannon. He did an hour-long show on the Fed. Everything I said, he said. He did a great job. Guess what? He was off the air in 2 weeks. They kicked him off. But he told the truth. He told the truth. Everything he said was true. And he essentially raised the alarm on the Fed, and 2 weeks later, he's off the air. That was no coincidence. I wish Rush Limbaugh would do the same thing. I wish he'd go after the Fed, and then they'd kick him off. But, and I usually vote Republican, but you know, when it comes to the Fed, what to me is such a disillusion. Democrats and Republicans, hardly anybody ever stands up to the Fed. Barry Goldwater did. Barney Frank did. Charles Bunning of Kentucky did. Rand Paul, they do. Hardly anybody else does. JFK? Yeah. Yes,
you may remember the name of the congressman who for years was trying to get a motion through to abolish the Federal Reserve, and he was killed in an airplane that was shot down by the Russians going down to Japan. What was his name?
He knows. He knows.
There are no coincidences, folks.
Well, that's why I didn't invite our local Federal Reserve executives to this speech. I still want to work as a financial advisor. Any more questions? Are we done?
I think we're done.
One more question.
One more. I guess if you can, just address what you know about what Iceland did and their recovery.
Well, Iceland is like the pimple of a backside of a giant elephant. And they did all the same stupid things that we did, and are still doing. Our big Fed banks are still cranking out derivative products like there's no tomorrow. And if there's anything that could wreck us in the next few years, it's when these derivatives go bad. The scary thing is that I have no doubt that Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and the rest of these clowns have sold debt derivatives to guarantee Greek debt, Italian debt, Spanish debt, and that's like a bug in search of a windshield. But unfortunately, since we are reserve currency and we're so big and Iceland is so little, what they did, I don't think we can do. I wish we could. I mean, I'm not opposed to taking all the Fed executives and all the folks that own them and lining up against a brick wall and doing the old Marxist thing and wipe them out and start over, but that ain't happening. Be done with Bank of America.
We're done with
Citibank.
questions.
Be done with it.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Now it's your turn to talk. So who wants to be first? He does. Sorry. Al Holman.
I thought that was a great presentation, and this message needs to be said over and over and over again so that people begin to believe it and realize it. And I've mentioned this book several times. That's why I brought it tonight, Creature from Jekyll Island. You owe it to yourselves to read it. It should be required in all schools. The Federal Reserve is something more monstrous than people are willing to even believe. I have mentioned this once before, but years ago a friend of mine was going through a neighborhood and he saw a yard sale and he stopped and there was a table of books and he was looking at the books, and underneath the table he saw a box of books that were leather bound and gold printing on them, Manuals, Board of Directors, Federal Reserve System. A chill went down his back, according to him. A woman came over and said, "You like those? I'll sell them to you for $30. So he bought the books. She said, "My husband was a chairman of the board of the Dallas Federal Reserve and he died and I'm just kind of cleaning out things." I don't think the Federal Reserve knew that those books were outside of the building. He would have been in serious trouble, in my opinion. And talk about secrecy. I think those books are more highly classified than nuclear secrets, frankly. I read part of those books. Terry got so angry that he literally bought a pallet of binders and started printing up about 450 pages of that stuff and selling them for cost. I don't remember a lot of what I read in there. It was years ago, but I do remember specifically that it states that the man who swears in as the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve shall expatriate from the United States before taking that office. Bernanke is not a citizen of this country. Why? Obviously, the duties are treason. There's no other reason for that. Now, I'm not making this up. I have pursued nothing but truth in my life. And by God, I've taken everything that I believe in, the middle word in that term is lie, and put it on the table for all challengers, even my religious beliefs. If you can prove a belief wrong, it's wrong. And I'll then look for something better to replace it with. I read these manuals. I read those things. It also states that the chairman of the board of the Federal Reserve is supreme in power over the President of the United States, over the judicial branch of the United States, and over the Congress of the United States. That is in those manuals. Believe it or not. Choose to, whatever you. But it's in there and I read it. It also states that there will be no money loaned through a Federal Reserve Bank for any alternative energy projects. That's the oil cartel influence. And that the Federal Reserve largely supports the CIA, which since we invaded Italy as the OSS in World War II, we had to have a power against Mussolini. Well, who do you think was opposed to Mussolini but the Sicilian Mafia, and they have been intertwined ever since. The Bay of Pigs, Bay of Pigs in Cuba, the Mafia was trying to get their casinos back in Havana. That's why Kennedy pulled back out of that. Plus, he didn't want World War III. These things go on and on and on, and people do not believe in conspiracies. If you bring that up, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. That has been drummed into us as a knee-jerk response so that we don't think about it. But this Federal Reserve, when you read how they put together that meeting, this was one of the biggest conspiracies in history. There's another man who was, I think, a dentist down in Houston who was from Guyana. And he wrote a book about the international banking system, of which the Federal Reserve is part. That World Bank and International Monetary Fund goes around, and like Guyana, it was a happy country. It was third world. It had plenty of food. You just walk off the road and go to a tree and eat fruit. Nobody starved in that country. And along comes the World Bank, probably bribes the president and says, oh, you need power plants, and you need bridges, and you need sewage systems and all this modern stuff. You need to come into the modern world, and today the interest on the national debt exceeds their gross national product. The Federal Reserve Act and the Internal Revenue Act were passed as one, both at the same time. And yes, that meeting happened after Congress had left. Don't tell me that's not conspiratorial. And Woodrow Wilson had it signed into law by the middle of the next afternoon. The IRS is the collection agency for the Federal Reserve. It is true, the statement that you made, that all of the money collected by the IRS is to pay on that fraudulent debt, on that fraudulent fiat money that they never had anything behind it at all. The Constitution of the United States states that the definition of the American dollar is 1 ounce of fine silver, and that Congress shall maintain the value of that dollar. And it also states we shall have no personal income tax. Both of these bills were declared by one of those congressmen, senators, to have been ratified in all the states, enough to pass it as an amendment to the Constitution, which it had to be for it to be legal. That never happened. The research has been done in all the state records. It never happened. It was a lie. This is one of the worst travesties against humanity, and if we don't get rid of the Federal Reserve, and it will be very hard to do, it's going to only be a lot worse.
Okay, who's next? Debbie, next. My turn, John. I should have said this sooner. You've got 5 minutes.
Only 5?
Well, thank you. That was an interesting conversation, lecture. So what we were talking about really was the very heart of the capitalist system as it exists today. Really, what is happening? We're living in the land of the masquerade. You know, everywhere you look, we're living in the land of masquerade. Example, we have TV evangelists masquerading as Christians. We have this capitalist system masquerading as capitalist. And we do not live in a capitalist system. We do not have a free market. We do not have free trade. We're living in the land of cartels. It's a pre-capitalist system. It's a mercantilist system. So it's no surprise that this gang of bankers got together and devised this system. It's another version of cartels. One thing that happened recently that was of note when Obama came in, Timothy Geithner, who became the Secretary of Treasury, was the head of the New York Federal Bank. It was his job to oversee the banks in New York. Okay? The business of the banking system and the financial system is to make money. Now, they don't make money when you have stable economic conditions. They only make money when the market is volatile, goes up and down. They've been making tons of money of late. Now, when they have a big crash, they make big money. I mean, he knew and they knew that this crash was coming because it's an engineered system. Now, basically, I agree, Lloyd. We have to reform the whole damn system, top to bottom. Now, we know that the capitalist system, as proposed, has no moral values. I mean, making money, it's in the beginning. But it should have ethical values. Well, long ago you should have honesty in accounting, auditing, and so on. But we don't, the legal profession, but we've seen it all subverted. So my take is that I propose we need, when you run an economy, there are 2 levers, the money supply and fiscal policy. That's to say government spending. They have to be controlled together. So yes, we certainly don't need the bankers running the money supply. What we need is a completely separate new institution that does that combined function. Now the problem, as I said the other week, is who do we get to run it? Who has the intellect and the honesty to run it in the benefit of the country? That's the fundamental problem. Now, but I would have let the banks go bust here. I would. And in England they did. The Royal Bank of Scotland went bust. They nationalised it. Now, after the war in England, the Labour Party came in, and my uncles and dad came back and they said, no, we're not going to put up with this crap. We suffered before the war. We would go into work and you get sent home, no pay, goodbye. That's now come back to England. They call it 0-hour contracts. You're contracted to work, but if there's no work, there's no pay. Goodbye. So we reverted back. No. They came back from the war and they said, fine. The Labour Party came in, they brought in free healthcare, free education, and they nationalised the Bank of England. Now, the new Labour, brought in by Tony Blair, who was a Thatcherite, beginning to end, idiot, and he was a complete charlatan. Gordon Brown was the next prime, he was basically the Chancellor. He privatised the Bank of England. So guess what happened? I mean, they took away all controls and it went wild. So you have to, I think, have a separate institution. You have to staff it with people that you can trust, okay? And you have to regulate everything and bring back ethics into the system. And I would say this, and I've proposed it before, we need a national development bank to fund start-up businesses in this country. We need to put people back to work. Because it's the American people that's going to rescue this country. It's not these idiots at the top. I spent my life working in corporate America. I never saw anybody with any great intellect. Never. I saw a lot of greedy idiots. You know, and I can, look, when I went to Imperial College London, Physics Department, there were 4 Nobel Prize winners there. Now I saw intellect at work. I've never seen it at the top of corporations. Well, Xerox was a case in point. They invented Windows and everything and gave it away for nothing to Apple and to Microsoft. You couldn't have bigger dopes than that. Anyway, look, America has got to get back to working again. Yes, it has to take a step back and look at all of its institutions. And that goes with my country as well. I mean, half the damn country has been sold off. I mean, my joke, which I'm going to put out in English, is there's a guy in front of Buckingham Palace, which has been renamed the Buckingham Hotel, and the guy is saying to the BBC, well, I'm sorry we have to sell our last remaining asset, but by God, we made a ton of money in fees.
Okay, who's next? George. George is next. George Nolan, you have the floor. 5 minutes.
I have no place to put this. Lloyd, you gave a presentation. You started with, I'm not a conspiracy type person. Usually when somebody tells me I'm not a conspiracy type person, I automatically think they are. We have other people here that are. We know that because we've heard them talk here before. And as far as the Federal Reserve is concerned, it was started, you're right, in 1913 after the crash in 1907. And whichever you have some interesting take on it, but I kind of put it all together. The people that have went to Congress in 2010, they didn't go to govern. They went to bury the government. No doubt in my mind. This, I feel, adds the same thing to it. Those that think the Federal Reserve has to be buried. You never talked about how long the term was, which is 14 years for each member. The chairman, which Bernanke is up, he's not going to run again because he's chairman and the co-chairman have 4-year terms. None of this was put in here. It was all a conspiracy type thing. And I believe that if we didn't have quantitative easing, we would be in the biggest depression we've ever been in, and this was the world. I do blame the bankers. There's no doubt in my mind that they did it. I was in New Zealand at the time, and in New Zealand the banks were paying 7% interest, and I thought maybe I should get some of my dollars over there and put into it. They were buying the subprime mortgage like they sold all over the world, put together, and I watched financial institution after financial institution fail. Now the answer, I don't believe, I did go to the Bush Library today, by the way. I call it the Library of Lies. But I'm sure there's others that don't. And the funny thing today is, I guess it was coincidence, Lloyd, but we sat in a room and you had a computer screen there. And there were different things that you could choose from. The Iraq War, the economy, they're this, they're that. And you pressed it, and whoever, well, at least they told us that, but I think it's kind of, may not be true. But they told us that the majority picked the economy. And they talked about TARP. And TARP actually, I'm sure most of you know, was September before Obama was elected president. So this started then. And the first votes from Congress was a no vote. A definitely no vote. So anyway, everybody had to choose from different things whether we agreed with Bush or didn't. And I kind of think that hindsight is 20/20. After 4 years, we know, I don't think bailing out the banks were that bad, personally. What I think was that bad is what the bankers did with that money by giving themselves raises and bonuses, etc., etc. And I think this was outrageous. And I also think that we saw one person that was charged with anything, a low echelon person that I think got 4 years. But again, I don't think I lump the people that have gone to Congress and don't want to govern, just want to bury, along with the people that want to get rid of the Federal Reserve with no other answer to it except a disaster, and I believe it's a conspiracy. Thanks.
Okay, who's next? You gotta be next. Okay. You have the floor, sir. 5 minutes.
I listened to the presentation this evening, and I've listened to the questions. I didn't ask any questions because I wanted to kind of see what's on the mind of the people here. And I've listened to the first rebuttals to the speech, and I'm not one that believes in conspiracy theories. I may be wrong, but I don't. When I look at the history of banking in the United States, the first bank started with the national government. Hamilton created the National Bank, and there was, Maryland didn't like it. We had McClellan versus Maryland, and the court said that they couldn't destroy the bank. And then later on, we had the Second National Bank, and as it has been indicated, Andrew Jackson did away with that. And if you look at the period between those two banks, when there was no national bank, we had chaos. The banks just did everything, and there were state banks, people lost their money, there was no federal deposit insurance, so they lost their money. And then they said just prior to the establishment of the Federal Reserve System under Wilson, there was a pretty severe recession, and that was designed to deal with it. And historians ask the question why we had a Federal Reserve Bank when we had the greatest depression in the United States. Why did it fail? Why wasn't it able to solve the problem? And some historians said it didn't have elasticity. It couldn't get the money where it was needed. So people were running on banks, they run out of money, and then that created further chaos. and they integrate that into it. Many people argue that the Federal Reserve System is unconstitutional, and so I said if the Federal Reserve System is unconstitutional, the National Bank is unconstitutional. If you look at the elastic clause in the United States Constitution, you look at Article 6, it says give the federal government, the Congress, some authority that may not be specifically written in the Constitution. And many things we do is that way. It stems from that. That being said, I get a little suspicious. Anyone said this is terrible, it's not working, and they can't describe something to replace it. Something to replace it that will make things better. I haven't heard that tonight. I've heard this twice, that we need to take the Federal Reserve System, we'll do away with it in both fiscal and monetary policy and put it in another type of organization that would not be really controlled by Congress. I don't think you can do that under the Constitution. I don't think that's constitutional because the Congress is given certain authorities specifically stated in the Constitution. I know what I've observed the Federal Reserve System during the 2007 recession. And really, it has done a great number of things that help people from going under, really, because Congress hasn't done a great deal because of the divide we have right now. So the Federal Reserve, if it hadn't hit, we would be in much worse trouble than we're right now. When I look at the recession of 2007, it's because we had no regulation. We had someone talk about the Glass-Steagall Act, and it was signed to be abolished by President Clinton, and it was legislated. The legislation was pushed by a former senator, not Powell, but what's that? Bill Graham. Yeah, I love him so well, I forget his name. But he was the one that pushed that, and we know that he had sold that a long time ago. And so when you do away with regulations, we look at the Federal Reserve had regulations, not Milton Friedman, but Greenspan did not enforce the regulations. Not the National Security Commission, the Security and Exchange Commission, they had regulations. They had a person that didn't believe in them, didn't do nothing. And the problem was because we had regulations, they were not very strong, but we didn't enforce those. But Greenspan had enough integrity to tell Congress he erred. Now the Security Exchange person has never admitted that he erred, and we know that he did. The problem is, if any system we come up, we've got to have some system of regulation. Regulated to ensure that fairness takes place between kind of an equilibrium between the various entities. And I also say, and women, don't throw rocks at me, because I don't have a different paradigm, and I'm going to quit when I say this. I tell my wife sometimes that you're just like banks. I can't live good with you, and I can't live hardly without you. So I think that's pretty much where we are right now with the system. Thank you.
Okay, who's next? That'll be next. Okay, just come on up here, Ray. Ray Crea is next. You got 5 minutes, Ray.
Well, first of all, I agree with just about everything that Lloyd said. I think that was excellent. I was trying to run down some information this afternoon, and when I realized I was remembering a book I had read that I had borrowed, so I returned it, so now I have to give some of this off the top of my head. But I think it was, the setting was around 1907, 1908. It might have been this panic that he was talking about. There was a bank that was failing. I believe this was in New York. Well, the bankers all realized if this bank goes under, there's going to be the ripple effect. This could be a disaster. We cannot let this bank fail. So the banks got together. This is before the Federal Reserve now. The banks got together. They said, whatever it was they did, they came together and they said, For one thing, nobody is going to be able to draw out all of their money. Well, now you might say, oh, there's something wrong with that. But they would give enough money for people to live on, to pay the expenses of their workforce, their labor. It was a weekly type thing, and it went on for several months. After maybe 6 months, the whole crisis was done and gone. Things continued back to normal. The lesson? This was before the Federal Reserve. The banks are smart. They can come together. They can fix these problems. And they fixed that problem. It could have been monumental, but they did it without a Federal Reserve. It wasn't needed. Now, we have the Federal Reserve came about in 1913, and it was probably because of that very incident. They were afraid of what might happen. The idea is, like a lot of things, that is such an illusion for us. We want security. Security, right? We are willing, in some cases, to give up our freedoms so we can be secure. It was Paul Harvey who said they wanted security. They were given chains, and now they are secure. The Fed comes along in 1913. 16 years later, we have the Great Depression. Now, how did that work? Did the Fed do anything? Pardon me. Did the Fed smooth out the economic cycles? Even since then, has the Fed prevented any of these bubbles? Did it prevent any recessions, depressions? Did it reduce shocks to the economy? Were people possibly lulled into complacency because they believed that the Federal Reserve was there to protect them? Don't we know what happens when people believe there are no problems, we will be bailed out, it'll be okay, we have nothing to lose? Don't all of us behave more conservatively when we realize there is a price to pay? And economies and people will do it a lot better if they realize that. One thing the Fed does do real well, Calvin just mentioned it, what they do really, really well is to defend themselves. They are so good at that, and every time they'll say, it could have been worse if we hadn't been there. That has got to be the lamest, most stupid excuse. If you and I, who would like to look in the mirror and think we're intelligent people, and we believe them, we just may not be quite as intelligent as we think we are. Why is the stock market so high right now? It's fallen a little bit in a few days, but 10 or 12 days ago, the stock market was at an all-time high, and as Lloyd has said, it is because the Fed is involved, government is buying, bonds galore. They are artificially making the market go up. So what we are in right now, this is not a free market. Whenever there's some economic disruptions of whatever sort, it's amazing to me that people will still want to blame a free market, and we have not got a free market. We're having less of a free market all the time. A news article was talking about seniors who thought they could live off of their savings. Sound familiar? Now those same seniors are hurting because they cannot make any money off of the savings. The interest rates are at an all-time low. Who keeps the rates low? That is the Fed. The Fed is controlling it. You don't get enough money off of your savings, there is a direct link between your low savings, your low return on savings, and Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke can in a second raise those rates, and he will not do that, not anytime soon. The rates have been kept low so that we can spur economic growth. How's that worked out? All right.
U.S. growth is barely 2%. China's growing faster than we are. But it'd be worse if it weren't for the Federal Reserve, wouldn't it? Okay. Thanks.
Okay, who's next? Gotta be a next. Well, it doesn't have to be. I like that. Why does there have to be? Here's the next one. What's your name?
I'm Stuart.
Stuart, all right.
I did a presentation a while back on mortgages.
I remember that.
Yeah, so, which the banks, by the way, are selling the mortgages over and over and over and over and over again. And you can't even find out who owns your house. So anyway, oh, a little higher? Okay. I want to thank, that was a really good presentation, just to acknowledge you for that. And it's really exciting to get to the root of the problem. Really, that's the Federal Reserve's the root of the problem, in my opinion. Wouldn't you agree? Absolutely. There's a reason they call it TV programming. Right? Because they're programming us on how to think. Democrat versus Republican. Conservative versus liberal. Blah, 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 blah. When all of them, it's like the World Wrestling Federation. I think everybody here already knows this, but it's like the World Wrestling Federation. They do this fake fight, argue over issues, and then they all go out and get cocktails and steaks afterwards and get their paycheck. Mainly I just want to say thanks. That's really good to get to the root of the problem. But I remember when Brzezinski was, Zbigniew Brzezinski was on Nixon's staff, and there were lots of protests against the Vietnam War. They asked Brzezinski, what do you think about all this protesting of the Vietnam War? And he said they can protest all they want, as long as they pay their taxes.
Okay, who's next? Sarah next? Are we running out of next? I can't believe this. We're running out of next. There aren't any more next. I guess I'm the last man standing. I'm the last one standing anyway. First of all, I want to thank our speaker for being here. He did a terrific job. And I think he said something about coming back in 6 months. Did you say that? All right, maybe we'll have him back in 6 months and he give us the sequel to this. All right. Anyway, one thing I forgot to ask him was, now I forgot what it was. But anyway, I forgot what I was going to do. Anyway, I'll let it go. Our speaker now gets to challenge. He gets to answer all these. I can remember what it was now. Glass-Steagall was never brought up tonight. It was brought up by, he's standing over there now. Anyway, after the first Depression in 1929, they imposed Glass-Steagall, which was to separate the banking industry into different segments, and they were not to get into risky investments with taxpayer money. That was the big thing. And our mortgage industry, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all that, none of that money would have got into the world market had it not been for the elimination of Glass-Steagall. So my question to the speaker, when he gets back up here, he can bring it up. If Glass-Steagall was reimposed, do you think the banking industry would be back to something more sane than we have now? So thank you. Let's put our speaker back on.
Absolutely. We got into the subprime mess because Glass-Steagall was taken away. And what happened is that largely the Fed investment banking is not the same as traditional retail or commercial banking. The investment bankers got their hands on the traditional conservative bank assets, and then we had to bail those morons out because trillions of dollars of everybody's deposits and CDs and money markets would have just gone away. So if we reenact Glass-Steagall, we'll get insurance companies out of the investment business, investment companies out of the banking business, because they have no business being there. I've worked for insurance companies. They don't know anything about investing, and they need to get the hell out of it. There is so much to cover. I couldn't talk about the Fed. There's just so much to cover.
That's why I have to come back. And when I talk about getting rid of the Fed, I'm talking about one day it's the Federal Reserve Bank, the next day it's the federal government. Because we do need regulatory authorities. And if the subprime crisis taught us anything about Wall Street, we must regulate them. We can't trust them. We can't trust them at all. The most egregious offenders of the subprime crisis were the Fed investment banks, because moral hazard is built into the system. If they screw up, they get bailed out. If my business goes belly up, no one bails me out. The day that we nationalize the Fed, they have to have congressional oversight. The NSA, the CIA, everybody else has congressional oversight. Our new American governmental Fed will have congressional oversight. And when our National American Fed has their quarterly open market committee meetings, they will be open. We will know what they say. But the big joke about the open market committee right now is nobody knows what the hell they do or say except for what they tell us. Quantitative easing is a blessing that will become a curse because it is setting us in a lose-lose scenario. It's going to cause inflation. The money supply is bloated. This money has wound up of quantitative easing into the reserves of our banks. For every dollar we give a bank, they can make 9 more. This $4 trillion of quantitative easing can easily cause 16, 17, 18 additional $1 trillion in the American economy. Now, I don't expect to walk down the street and see a $100 bill blowing in the wind and not reach over and pick it up. But we do have inflation coming, and the problem with the decisions that have been made is that once interest rates come up, we're looking at a bond market crash. It doesn't make sense to talk about creating jobs when we're in a lose-lose situation. Interest rates come up, this economy slows down. We get inflation, this economy slows down. Plus the fact when we get inflation, we're looking at a $20 trillion debt in 2016. At 2% interest on our debt, which is what most of our debt is financed at, that is $458 billion. At 4% interest rate, we're looking at close to $900 billion in interest. That means an additional $500 to $600 billion trimmed out of governmental services because there is no more money. Thank you very much tonight. If you know of any groups that would want to hear this, I would be happy to give it. When I go speak at Rotary clubs, I know a lot of the local bankers would afterwards want to get like a noose and string me up because they love the Fed. So, thank you very much.
Our formal announcement here is done for tonight. Our speaker is still here. They're going to kick us out at 11 o'clock. You're free to do what you want, so thank you very much. What, 10? Is it 10 when they kick us out? No, 10 o'clock. All right, they're going to kick us out at 10 o'clock. Well, you're free to talk to the speaker, do what you want, etc. The formal meeting is over. Thank you.
This is William, your videographer from Two Hats Publishing. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, please leave comments below, or like us, or follow us, and get notices to all our videos. Remember, when visiting the Mecca restaurant at the corner of Skillman Avenue and Live Oak, tell them you want your reservations to the next College of Complexes.